The Phantom Feast. Guillermo Vertes had been fighting the losing battle with the Loyalists during most of 1938 and 1939. Then, as the tide of battle turned and the Francistas began to rout the Loyalists, those who could escape under their own power fled towards the Pyrenees. Guillermo was among the droves of fleeing people struggling against the elements, the cold and hunger, to cross the frozen wastes of ragged mountains to France in safety. In such a mass exodus, every man and woman was for himself. There was no time for tarrying. The Francistas were at their heels, baying like wolves after the scent. Of the refugees, little could be said of them except that they were a sorry, pitiable lot, marching along with thousands of other disillusioned men returned from Barcelona and other points in Spain. Young Guillermo could think of only two things: a warm climate and filling his hungry belly with food and drink. He had been ordered, along with his comrades in arms, not to stop for the hundreds of refugees they would meet along the march. To do so, the commanding officer warned, would be suicide. Moreover, if any man among them was to fall, unable to continue the rigorous march, he was to be left to his own fate. Such were the bitter instructions of a defeated army. When his company had reached a point approximately 115 kilometers from the French border over the mountains, the long line of weary men came upon a tragic sight. Bending over the prostrate form of a soldier in a rag-tag Loyalist uniform was a frail young woman. She was attempting to stop the flow of blood issuing forth from the bullet wounds of the fallen man. As the battle-hardened veterans trudged past, they shook their heads compassionately, knowing that such stomach wounds were nearly always fatal. Obviously, there was no hope for the man. But just as Guillermo came abreast of the woman, he found himself unable to go on. So tragic was the sight of that young woman kneeling over the fallen man that his heart immediately went out to her. He had to do something. He could not force himself to go on, especially after seeing her pathetic face, and despite the derisive comments of his companions who told him, "Hey, Guillermo, what you want to do, commit suicide with them? You know he is beyond help. You know the Francistas are at our heels like jackals." As their voices and the sound of the trudging feet diminished, leaving him behind, Guillermo went to the woman's aid. He stopped her from giving the man water to drink, telling her that to do so would be certain death for men wounded in the intestines. With several long poles taken from a wrecked horse cart, Guillermo fashioned a crude stretcher. He then placed the wounded man on a pallet of rags, which he made fast to the poles. With the man then supported a few inches above the ground, young Guillermo bent his shoulders to the almost impossible task of dragging the stretcher along, and proceeded to follow the refugees. As he trudged along, he was possessed with one thought. He had to carry the man to safety, to take him to France, although he knew the odds were against him, that in all probability the man would probably die before he could get him to safety or to a doctor. He somehow could not think of anything else except pulling the man behind him. He wondered why he was doing this, and he also marveled at his own stamina. The strange new strength that had suddenly begun to surge through his muscles enabled him to go on. Only a short time before, Guillermo had desperately struggled to march along beside his companions at arms, but now he was walking easier, almost effortlessly, and hardly feeling the pangs of hunger at all. Occasionally, when he would pause to check the makeshift sled and the buy-in securing his helpless passenger, the man would look at him with grateful eyes and would try to form words with his lips, but no sound would come. As his wife moved along beside him, her eyes filled with the tears of gratitude, Guillermo could not help but feel the surge of power that went through him. Despite the bitter cold and the deep snowdrifts, and despite the fact that the main body of refugees seemed to be floundering in the vast, barren wasteland over which they were marching, Guillermo continued on without let-up. The soldier's wife came up beside him, and asked in a timid voice, "Are we not going in the wrong direction?" Guillermo nodded. "No, we are going the right way. The others seek an easier way, but there are none." "But how do you know this? You do not have a map or a compass," the woman asked him worriedly. To this Guillermo replied, I do not know how I know which way we must travel, but all I can say is that I go by the same instinct that forced me to stop and help you." "Forced you?" queried the woman in astonishment. Gelarmo nodded. "See, I felt forced to do what I have done. I do not know why or how, but my feet would just not go on. It is strange, I admit, but that is all I can tell you." Without pausing to rest, they continued their march all that night and all the next day. When they finally came to a flat land where they could rest, Gelarmo cautioned the woman and bade her to remain concealed behind a rock. He pointed up to the peaks they had to climb and told her, "We must wait here until dark. We must not go in the logical direction, for we will be shot." The woman looked at him in surprise. She turned her gaze toward the foothills, stretching beyond them through which they had just come. "But I see no one." Gelarmo smiled thinly. He closed his eyes and huddled in the shelter of a rock. "They will come, so you will remain beside your husband and wait." It was nearly dusk when Gelarmo awakened, tapped the woman on the shoulder, and motioned, "See." He pointed down at the foothills. Merciful God, the woman gasped. Before them, as far as the eye could see, were hundreds of Francistas. She turned to look up at him with awe in her eyes. "How did you know they would be following us through the ravines?" Gelarmo struggled. "I do not know. I just knew it somehow. I cannot explain how I knew. What happened after that is history. The Francistas captured thousands of the fleeing loyalists and framed trail-weary refugees. Those who were not slaughtered were herded in mile-long columns in the death marches back to Spain. When it was safe for them to resume their journey, Gelarmo shouldered his burden, and they continued, taking food where they found it. 5 days later they reached freedom, the French border. After his badly wounded passenger had been taken to a hospital, Gelarmo sat sharing bread and cheese and wine with the man's wife in a refugee camp before striking out again for his home. The woman pressed his big hand gratefully to her cheek and said, "My husband is a fine cook. He says that some day he will cook you a fine meal. He swore this to me that last night, and I hope some day that he will. But it looks like," she said, breaking off in a spasm of sobs, "he will not live to make that promise good." Gelarmo stood up. He gently patted her head and said, "He will live, and some day he will cook me that meal. I shall depend on it." The next morning Gelarmo learned that a large funeral was being held for many refugees who had died during the night. But Gelarmo did not go to the funeral. He walked away toward the line of trucks waiting to disperse the refugees, and he had a strange lilt to his step and a lightness in his heart. He did not know why he felt this, when perhaps he should have been saddened at the prospect of the death of the soldier he had rescued. But he did not pause to reflect. He somehow knew that the man would be all right. That feeling was to come true a decade later. The time was 1948. The place, Acapulco, Mexico. Gelarmo and his friend were visiting the resort city for a few days, when for no reason he could explain, he suddenly took his wife by the hand and said, "Come, we are going to have a fine dinner, one that we shall remember for the rest of our lives." His wife looked at him, shrugged and smiled, but Gelarmo did not pay attention to her. His smiling face was fixed on a small restaurant several blocks away from their hotel. They could see it from the sidewalk on the hill they were descending. Then, when they went in, a man in a waiter's uniform took one look at Gelarmo, rushed over to him, and clasped him like a long-lost brother. "It is you!" he cried. Although Gelarmo did not recognize the man at first, he did recognize the man's wife. It seems that a few years after their escape had been made, the wounded soldier and his wife went to Mexico, where they opened a small restaurant. Indeed, Gelarmo did enjoy a meal fit for a king that day. It was quite a reunion, the happy ending to an amazing but true experience, but no one was more delighted or happier than the dying soldier who didn't die, who returned to cook a feast for his rescuer in another land, thousands of miles away, at another happier time. Just why Gelarmo had been impelled to act as he did, or how he had sensed what he had to do, he cannot explain. The fact remains that it happened, and in all probability Gelarmo himself would not be alive today if he had not stopped to carry another human being to freedom, for not one among his company of soldiers lived to tell the tale. All were killed in the bloodbaths that followed.